podcast for queer spirituality, because being queer is a spiritual path, with your host, Carly Phillips. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sapphic and Spiritual Podcast, the podcast for queer spirituality. Today, we're getting witchy on the podcast. Have you ever noticed that there's a good amount of queer women that identify as a witch? Why are so many of us drawn to the supernatural and maybe have a crystal collection? Why is there a stereotype that lesbians will ask you your astrological sign within minutes of meeting? Today's episode takes us on a multifaceted journey throughout the history or herstory of witches and the witch trials, how it all connects to being queer, the witch wound, and we'll end today's episode with an impromptu guided meditation to help heal our witch wound and call back our power. Trigger warning, this episode does talk about the witch trials and violence toward women, so if you're not feeling like you're in the right space for that today, come back to this episode when you're ready or skip it. As someone who came out as a lesbian in her 30s, when TikTok started showing me witchy lesbians on my For You page, I was like, wait a minute, there's a connection here? Could this be why I was the kid checking out the beginner's guide to palm reading books at the library in middle school? Seeing this influx of queer women identifying as a witch or psychic or offering tarot readings suddenly felt like a lot about me made sense. And for years I wondered, what's the connection here? Why are so many of us witchy? To get to the bottom of it, we'll need to first explore the herstory or history of what it means to be a witch. Think about the word witch. The patriarchal presentation of the word witch tells us that witches are evil, dark, ugly, demonic. So where did this all start? Well, the witch trials, of course. But before we even get to the witch trials, we have to go even further back to ancient spiritual practices. Thousands of years before the story of Abraham serving as a prophet of Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, ancient cultures spanning multiple continents practiced goddess worship. How do we know this? Well, archaeological evidence. There have been over 200 Venus figurines found in Europe and Asia that are anywhere from 25,000 to 40,000 years old. These Venus figurines are small sculptures that depict female figures, oftentimes with exaggerated features associated with fertility and motherhood, like big boobs, big butts, big bellies, and they are believed to be associated with mother goddess worship, and they are also some of the earliest known works of art that have been discovered. Because yes, the female body, goddess or not, is definitely an artistic masterpiece. My first experience with the Venus figurines came in 2006, 2007, somewhere around there. And I was 17 years old, and I was at an inpatient eating disorder treatment center in Philly, going through just a really dark time in my life. And at the treatment center, they used this level system. So only the people who earned enough points by being the most compliant were able to earn the privilege of being able to leave campus. And we called it going on pass. So I remember one night, I had only been at the treatment center like a few days or a week, and a group of girls who had just got back from going on pass had brought these little charms for all of us. And they were these tiny charms that could be put on a necklace or something like that. And they were depictions of Venus figurines that they had found at a metaphysical shop. Mind you, none of us called them Venus figurines or even knew what they were. But I remember them handing me this miniature silver figurine charm-like thing and saying, we had to get this for all of us to remind us how powerful we are, to teach us to love our bodies. They were like, look, they have these big stomachs, these big boobs, they're beautiful, and maybe we should learn to love our bodies too. We thought everyone needed this. We just felt really inspired. When I think about that now, almost 20 years later, it gives me the chills. We were just a group of girls at war with our womanhood, hating our bodies, in such pain because of patriarchal standards that told us we had to look a certain way, drowning in trauma and abuse, and somehow, As if it was buried in our bones, a few teenage eating disordered patients found these replicas of Venus figurines and inherently knew that these statues could help us, that the goddess could help us and inspire us, that they could bring us together to support us and to support each other, and, just maybe even begin to heal us and offer us hope. This idea of honoring the feminine, of a mother goddess being a divine creatrix of all, that knowing is intuitive, even if we don't have the language or remembrance to describe what or who it is. And that's exactly why the rise of monotheism and patriarchal religions went after the witch. As we are well aware, history tells the story of the victories of the oppressors and not of those they oppressed. So it's no surprise that even Googling history of witches and witchcraft in 2024 still produces articles and images that reinforce Christian patriarchal views of witches as either being terrifying demonic baby eaters and sorcerers, or Sanderson sisters, broomstick riding, Halloween gimmicks that money can be made from. So with that being said, a thorough detailed history or herstory of the origins of witchcraft is actually really hard to come by. But we do know its origins are associated with paganism and goddess worship. The term witch arose from Old English origins as one who practices sorcery. Around the 15th century, we start to see the word witch being used as weaponry against women, specifically women who were postmenopausal, widowed, practitioners of medicine, really anyone who went against what was considered to benefit the patriarchy at the time. In order for patriarchy to thrive in Europe, any ties to the spiritual practices of the ancestors had to be erased because women could be empowered through their ancestral practices. Goddess worship meant acknowledging that women are powerful, that women can birth new worlds, that nature is a source of wisdom. And all of that was a threat to patriarchy and Christianity. So that led to the witch trials, or as some call it, the burning times in Europe. And as a side note, I'm just looking at the implications of witchcraft from a Western colonization standpoint. Each and every culture and corner of the world has their own sacred and ancient practices, and I highly suggest researching the pre-colonization spiritual practices of your ancestors. So let's go back in time to the 1200s, the 1300s. You have the Crusades, then you have the bubonic plague, and people are looking for a scapegoat. It's so hard to find an accurate estimate of how many people died as a result of the witch trials, especially considering many weren't recorded. But recorded history tells us anywhere from 40,000 to 60,000 were killed, while I've heard channeled messages putting that number in the millions, from the 1400s to the 1700s, with 75 to 80% of victims being women. What classified someone as a witch? Well, there was a book for that. In 1486, the Malleus Maleficarium, otherwise known as the Hammer of the Witches, was published in Germany as a way to share the dangers of witchcraft, how to identify witches, how to conduct a witch trial. And according to this text, witches were women who acted outside of gender norms, were widowed, elderly, poor, midwives, or even women who had a strong personality. The women that were convicted of witchcraft were just ordinary women living slightly outside the realm of what society deemed acceptable for women at that time. There's an article on Mental Floss, I'll link it in the show notes, but it talks about 17 signs that you would qualify as a witch in 1692. I'm not going to read all 17, but let's do a put a finger down challenge with 10 to see if you would have been on trial for witchcraft in 1692. And all you need is to answer yes to just one of these to have been accused of witchcraft in 1692. So let's get started. Put a finger down if you identify as a woman. So how many of us are out already? Number 2, put a finger down if you've had premarital sex. Number 3, put a finger down if you have one or more woman friends, because having female friends meant you were possibly in a witch coven. Number 4, put a finger down if you have had an argument or disagreement with someone. Number 5, put a finger down if you are married with too few children or no children at all. Number 6, put a finger down if you have exhibited stubborn, strange, or forward behavior. That's me every day. Number 7, put a finger down if you have a mole, birthmark, or third nipple. What is it with these men during this time and third nipples? Anyway, just saying. Number 8, put a finger down if you have broken any rule of the Bible, meaning you've made a pact with the devil. Number 9, put a finger down if you can't support yourself financially. And completely contradictory, number 10, put a finger down if you are rich or financially independent. So who else is burning at the stake with me? My guess is everyone who's listening. So the witch hunts had implications for all women. So even one of the most beloved historical female figures, Joan of Arc, she fell victim to the witch hunts herself. George Chastain, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he was a historical writer of the time, and he wrote this about Joan. He said, "Then the maid, Joan of Arc, surpassing the nature of a woman, took on a great force, and took much pain to save her company from defeat, remaining behind as the leader and as the bravest of the troop. But their fortune permitted for the end of her glory and for the last time that she would ever carry arms. An archer, a rough and very sour man, full of much spite because a woman, who so much had been spoken about, should have defeated so many brave men, grabbed the edge of her cloth of gold doublet and threw her from her horse flat to the ground. So after that, she was then captured, sold to the English, and put on trial for heresy, which was anything blasphemous within Christianity, so basically witchcraft. In addition to Joan being this badass warrior in a time when women couldn't be that, she was also a highly intuitive woman who, even on trial, she would not deny the fact that she had received visions from Archangel Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, and she stood by her belief to the very end that these visions were divine. And she burned at the stake for that at 19 years old. The scary thing is witch hunts are not just a thing of the past. There are actual witch hunts that still occur today in 2024. Let that soak in for a minute. According to the United Nations, witch hunts around the world are increasing, predominantly in developing countries with poor access to healthcare, poverty, and epidemics like AIDS. In 2009, a young girl was burned alive in New Guinea after she was accused of witchcraft and spreading AIDS. In 2020, Al Jazeera reported that in the Central African Republic, that elderly people, typically women, are being accused and killed for witchcraft. To avoid being killed, they're left with two options: lock themselves up in their homes and hope that no one comes for them, or go to prison where they can be violently tortured by guards or other inmates. The article tells the story of one woman whose nephew accused her of putting a spell on her older sister to cause an illness, and she is imprisoned in her own home, fearful of being killed. It's 2024, and the dangerous ripple effects of the witch hunts continue. While historians say the witch trials ended in Europe and in the Americas in the 1700s, patriarchal condemnation of women who dance to the beat of their own drum has never left our reality in the West. Today, the witch hunts just look a little different than they did in Salem in the 1600s, but it hasn't ended. It just changed form. I'm not sure exactly when this episode will post, but I'm recording it on April 4th, 2024. And within this week, here's some of the news headlines. So in my former home state, the Florida Supreme Court passed a 6-week abortion ban that will take effect on May 1st, 2024. This is just another way to demonize women, to take away their power to make important decisions regarding their bodies, while insinuating that women who have had abortions are deviant, murderers, and immoral. This is the new witch hunt. Also this past week, Easter Sunday fell on Trans Day of Visibility. All over social media, I had the most hateful comments showing up from people up in arms over the fact that Trans Day of Visibility was being celebrated on Easter, despite the fact that Easter changes every year, while Trans Day of Visibility has consistently been observed on March 31st since 2009. Words like disgusting and far more hateful slurs were being used to describe trans people by so-called followers of someone who preached tolerance and love. This is the new witch hunt. Just last month, in March of 2024, North Carolina elected Mark Robinson, the Republican nominee for governor, a man who has referred to LGBTQ plus people as filth and compared queer people to maggots and, I quote, what cows leave behind. A man who stated that seeing a pride flag hanging outside of a church makes him feel sick. And if that's not terrible enough, he's called the trans rights movement full of the spirit of the Antichrist. This is the new witch hunt. On March 23rd, a few weeks ago, Kelly, my wife, I love saying that, but we got married. And it's been wild when I stop and reflect upon the fact that until 2015, so 9 years ago, we would not have been able to have a legal marriage. What was the happiest day of my life couldn't have happened in the same way a decade ago. Yet it's the same othering, scapegoating, and fear-based rhetoric that prevented a single person blood related to me to attend my wedding. In their defense, they weren't invited. But for some of them, they weren't invited because they're homophobic and truly believe that I'm going to hell for being gay. The witch hunt continues. For queer women and queer people in general, we are no strangers to being demonized. In modern times, witch hunts are disguised by different names, and they prey on different targets, like the Lavender Scare, for example. In the US in 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower passed Executive Order 10450, which allowed for queer people to be investigated and removed from positions within the federal government, as it was believed that being gay or lesbian was a moral character flaw. This is said to have been born out of the Red Scare of the 1950s that spread fear related to the threat of communism. In a Time magazine article from 2020 that I'll put in the show notes, they explain the political and moral fears about alleged subversives became intertwined with a backlash against homosexuality, as gay and lesbian culture had grown in visibility in the post-war years. The Lavender Scare tied these notions together, conflating gay people with communists and alleging they could not be trusted with government secrets and labeling them as security risks, even though there was no evidence to prove this. It's estimated that between 5,000 and 10,000 people lost their jobs due to the Lavender Scare. No different than the witch trials, a similar strategy was used to scapegoat and punish queer people who fell outside societal norms that don't align with patriarchal values. I think it's safe to say without question that queer people most certainly would have been burned at the stake during the witch trials. In fact, they were. It's hard to locate records of lesbians being persecuted during the witch trials because the idea of a woman having sexual desires or any sexuality at all during the time of the witch trials was just not heard of. There's an After Ellen article that mentions a woman named Maud Galt, who lived in Scotland in the 17th century, who was killed for witchcraft due to being a lesbian. The article quotes historian Julian Godair, who wrote, "Galt's case shocked authorities. The idea of witchcraft was easier to cope with than her lesbianism." Let me read that again so it sinks in. The idea of witchcraft was easier to cope with than her lesbianism. So let's bring it back to the original question we started with today of why do so many lesbians identify as a witch? Well, this is why. Maybe identifying as a witch goes beyond a connection to the supernatural or living with the flow of nature or using divination tools. What if being a witch is more simple than that? The conclusion I've drawn is that being a witch is anyone who threatens patriarchy, period. And as lesbians, as queer women, it's been said before, and I'll say it again, our existence is resistance. Just simply living as myself out in the world as a lesbian witch with autism, it's an embodied form of protest to a system of tyranny. As queer women, the odds are already stacked up against us. And then if we add on other layers to that, like for queer women of color, for example, it's even more heightened. It's even more threatening to the patriarchal system. So I believe the connection between lesbians and witchcraft is in some ways just a part of our DNA. We've inherited the societal trauma that began long before we were born. And the more we wake up to ourselves, the more we embrace who we are, the more we remember these collective truths. It's like the Devin Cole song, Witch, the one that goes, oh, should I sing it? It's like, she's a woman in total control of herself. That song, where witch stands for woman in total control of herself. And at the end of the day, if that's what a witch is, a woman in total control of herself, no wonder the patriarchy hunts us, because they don't want us to be in total control of ourselves. They want to be the ones in total control. And this is evident in things like abortion bans. So if you're a woman who lets her heart lead the way, who's boldly herself, who doesn't fit the mold, maybe you embrace that witch archetype. You existing fully as you and living in your own truth, that's magic, baby. Own it. That act of bravery can change the world. And maybe you're light. Maybe you living as you out in the open, maybe that helps inspire someone else to do the same. We're reclaiming the word witch. By identifying with the word witch, we're saying to the men who tainted its reputation, no more. That a witch is not a demon or a sinner or someone to fear, but an empowered woman. When I think about how I used to view the term witch when I was younger, for whatever reason, this memory always pops into my mind of a former mentor of mine who was of a certain age and generation, who hated hearing women referring to themselves as witches. She would say, I just don't understand why spiritual young women today want to be called witches. It's just so evil sounding. I think light worker is just a better term. And this type of belief was coming from someone who, from the outside looking in, one would consider them to be a highly spiritual person. But even she was sold the story of witches being evil and just couldn't see past her own cultural conditioning. And it's funny because I've noticed that for me, that experience of her saying that about using light worker instead, it's actually given me this slight ick for the term light worker because I feel like it's used in some ways as a more palatable term. I feel like it puts women in this box of having to be light and airy and positive when the reality is you can't have light without dark. Any type of spiritual work we're doing, it's a balance of both. Darkness is not something to fear, but an opportunity to shine light on it and lean deeper into loving those parts of us. And by darkness, I'm referring to sitting with our trauma, our fears, the hard truths that make us feel uncomfortable, the parts of us in society we deem unworthy, and our big emotions. We can't just spiritually bypass our way through the darkness and be like, oh, love and light, love and light. The only way out is through. And that's why I love using the term witch to identify with over words like light worker, because for me, I resonate much more deeply with the feelings of empowerment that come through grit and resilience and being the underdog and being misunderstood, because that's my lived experience. That's what I know. For me, the word witch feels similarly to how I once viewed the word lesbian. I thought lesbian was a dirty word. For a long time, I couldn't utter the word lesbian because it left me feeling these physical feelings of discomfort and shame because I was taught to believe that just like the word witch, the word lesbian was a dirty word. Even though I knew I was a lesbian, there was a period of time I just couldn't say it. Funny but embarrassing story at the same time. The first date I ever went on with a woman, I remember her asking me, how I identified. And I said something that looking back, I'm like, oh my God, Carly, really? But anyway, I said to her, all the way. Like, what does that even mean? All the way, right? I remember her looking back at me with a ton of compassion, but also with slight confusion. And also she picked up on the fact that I was uncomfortable with using the word. And she goes, oh, all the way? You mean like all the way gay? And I just was like, yeah, gay. Even gay was easier for me to say than lesbian. Even in the presence of another lesbian, I couldn't say it because of all of these layers of shame that surrounded the word for me at the time. Fast forward now a few years, and I love identifying as a lesbian, and I love saying it loud and proud because I remember the times that I was too afraid to say it. There's power in reclaiming words like lesbian and witch and saying, you know what? These aren't dirty words at all. I'm proud to be a lesbian. I'm proud to be a witch. We take the words out of the hands of the oppressors and back into the hands of their rightful owners, who will proudly serve them in justice and honor them. A lot of what stops us from feeling empowered in our identity or feeling fearful to be seen in our truest sense of self goes back to the witch wound. The witch wound, or at least how I experience it, it's a collective wounding that impacts us as women that stems from the persecution of women throughout history. So it comes from the witch hunts. Through epigenetics, we've learned that the impact of trauma can be passed down through generations. Even though we might not consciously remember, our bodies remember and our souls remember. For me, the witch wound shows up in my life when I experience an intense fear of being seen. It's when I dim my light to fit in. It's when I preface something I'm about to say to someone about a spiritual topic that I'm passionate about with, I know this probably sounds weird, but it's when I doubt myself and my abilities. It's when I'm terrified other people will think I'm crazy. It's when I choose to stay hidden, even though I don't want to. The witch wound manifests as internalized shame, guilt, and fear. The witch wound disconnects us from our true self because we're too busy trying to blend in with everyone else to ensure our safety and survival in a patriarchal system that is always on the hunt and looking for someone to blame. As queer women, we know what it feels like to be hated for our existence. And at a subconscious level, we remember or are beginning to remember what it must have felt like for the women who came before us to live in their death, to fear being burned at the stake. So how do we heal the witch wound? How do we begin to even touch the surface of such deep wounding in our collective? Well, I think it starts first with us recognizing that we have a witch wound, that it's present in our lives. Bringing awareness to something is always the first step in setting us free. We observe how it plays a role in our lives, how it goes hand in hand with us playing small, and when we're ready, we make the brave choice to do the things that scare us anyway. If you're someone like me who has access to some past life memories or believe in reincarnation, we may even be able to feel, perceive, or see times in which we were literally burned at the stake or persecuted as a witch. And in those situations, I just tell myself, we're not in that lifetime anymore. We're safe now. And you know what? For some of us in certain situations, maybe we're not safe. Maybe we live in communities where being a spiritual woman who's also queer just is not safe. And in those cases, I think that's when we need to find our own community and our own family, even if that's an online community and family. I think connection is one way to combat the witch wound. It's no coincidence that one of the characteristics in Hammer of the Witches, the book that we talked about earlier in the episode that showed different classifications of witches, and one of which was women having female friends. That was purposeful because when we connect with other like-minded women, we realize we aren't alone. And there's power in numbers. So connection is another way to heal the witch wound. Also, circling back to the quote, existence is resistance, don't underestimate how healing just being yourself actually is. That alone can combat the witch wound because you are giving yourself permission to flourish and exist in a world that can be incredibly cruel for you to exist in. And that's powerful. Earlier in the episode, we talked briefly about Joan of Arc. And I want to go back to her for a moment as we end because she's really coming up strongly in my life right now, especially as I've been working on this episode. This morning, actually, I pulled an oracle card, and it was an illustration of Joan of Arc with her sword in hand. And I hadn't planned on doing this at all, but you know what? Yeah, we're just going to do it. Okay, I guess that's the beauty of this being my own podcast, that I can do whatever I want or feel called to do. So I'm getting a strong calling to end the episode today with a short guided meditation to help us sever any ties to our witch wound and to call back our power. So if you're in a place that allows for you to do so, you can close your eyes. And if not, obviously, if you're driving, please do not close your eyes and just, listen to this or come back to it later if you'd like. Take a deep breath in through your nose and a deep breath out through your mouth. And another just like that. A deep breath in and out. Within your heart space, imagine a ball of golden light glowing brightly. Maybe it's a candle, a lantern, or maybe it's the sun. And focus on that golden light in the center of your heart. Feel its warmth radiating throughout your body. As you breathe in, notice the light expanding. See it move through every cell within your body and watch it radiate outward, creating a golden circle of light around your physical body and out into your auric field. Suddenly, you sense before you a sword appear in your left hand. Notice its size, its shape, its color. This is the sword of truth given to you by Joan of Arc, and it carries with it the ability to cut through all that is false, all that is not aligned with your highest expression of self. Take a moment to bring to your attention any thoughts, any limiting beliefs, any situations or worries, anything that represents your personal witch wound or the collective witch wound. Bring them to your awareness now. Maybe it's the belief that you aren't powerful or worthy. Maybe it's a person who makes you feel not good enough. And I want you to imagine these beliefs or situations forming together in front of you what looks like a ball of yarn, with one string connecting you to that ball of yarn. The more you put into the ball of yarn, the bigger it becomes. When you feel complete, take the sword of truth that rests in your left hand. And in a moment, you are going to cut the string that connects you to the ball of yarn of negative beliefs in front of you. As you imagine doing that, say these words out loud with me. I release any and all attachments to my witch wound. I let go of any limitations that prevent me from stepping fully into my power. They are no longer welcome in my essence. I am a sovereign being and forever am untethered to any and all energies that seek to disempower me. It is safe to be me. My uniqueness is a gift to the world. I stand with peace in my own power. When you are ready, cut the string with your sword, knowing that by doing so, you are free. Take a deep breath in and out, and when you are ready, you can come back to the present moment. Okay, so I just felt this intense urge to do that out of the blue. So I hope that helped whoever it was meant for. So now, back to the closing quote, one of my favorites from Joan of Arc that reminds us to stand in our power. I'm not afraid. I was born to do this. All right, sending love to all of you, and see you next time.